there is a reason why I used that analogy. It's not the first time, and it basically is me ribbing physicists, because physicists have been trying to come up with a grand unifying theory of everything for about
for many years.
3,000 years, something like that. And we got all of ours in the space of about 100 years within the last 2 centuries. But so let's talk about that then, because the history is fascinating, that this unit of life, which is universal, all life is made of cells, and there's a second rule of cell theory, which we'll come to in a minute. But no one's actually seen one until 1673, something like that?
Yes.
And what was life made of before we saw that?
Well, lots of people have lots of theories about life. I mean, the idea was that life or flesh was continuous. We were essentially slabs of meat, but without anything underneath the slabs of meat. We were just continuous slabs of meat, thinking slabs of meat, but slabs of meat nevertheless. And it wasn't until Robert Hooke looked down through his microscope and found, Hooke was an incredible character. So there's Hooke. He comes from a relatively poor family, gets a scholarship to Wadham College, and then becomes an apprentice. And what's amazing about Hooke, I quote him and I say his intelligence was phosphorescent and elastic, like a rubber band that glows while it stretches. And that's partly because Hooke was hooked onto everything. He was a physicist. There's a little bit of a joke in that line. He was actually he invented the laws of elasticity. He was a physicist, he was a chemist, he was as I'll say, a biologist, an architect, name it, he did it. And he published a book called Micrographia, in which he looked down his microscope and started studying small things, starting with ants and pests and things like that. And in one of those studies, he cut a piece of cork and he put it under the microscope, and he didn't see cells because the cork was dead, but he saw the outlines of cell walls, and suddenly began to realize that what seemed continuous, a piece of cork, was in fact made up of what he called a great many little boxes. Now Hooke he didn't make much of it. He sort of drew it and then sort of went on to his other many thousand pursuits. There was about a decade later, give or take, there was a Dutch cloth trader, cloth merchant, never trained in science, had barely any scientific vocabulary, who decided to invent another kind of microscope, a simple microscope, to look at the quality of thread. The Netherlands was like a booming nexus of cloth trade, and he was in Delft, and he decided that he was going to look at thread. And then one day he thought, why don't I use this microscope to look at a drop of water? And inside that drop of rainwater, he found hundreds of single-celled, we now think protozoa, but various kinds of animals. He called them animalcules. You have this wonderful story about him. He looked at his own semen and found sperm, which he called genital animalcules. We can talk about that story in a second. But went on and on and on. I mean, he looked at he looked at human tissue, and he started writing letters to the Royal Society, where of course Hooke was then the president, and Hooke realized that in fact what he had seen in these little boxes was all over. It was all over the animal kingdom, these little swimming animalcules. Now this is before cell theory is established. This is just people finding and looking at cells. And that's the first time anyone ever saw a cell. I know you've used one of the microscopes that. Yeah.
I mean, you didn't have to bring it up here, but the story behind the semen is that he wrote all of these letters up, and he was ignored by the Royal Society.
Exactly, yeah.
Because he wasn't a bewigged gentleman of science, and he wrote in Dutch.
Yeah, and very colloquially.
So he didn't publish his observations of his own semen, but he is the first person to see his sperm. It's just a line. The reason Sid's bringing this up is because there's a line in his notes, which are unpublished, in which he says that he acquired this sample not by sinfully defiling himself, but as a natural byproduct of conjugal coitus. Which is so much worse. And the second reason he's mentioning this now is because a few years ago I made a documentary in which we went to the Van Leven Hook Museum, and we also looked at a similar sample, which
Yes.
was mine.
We'll keep it at that, yes.
It was an
No one was expecting to talk to
No.
you.
I mean, it was on BBC 4, so no one saw it anyway. Anyway, so Van Leven Hook is the first person to see any cell, and he sees protist, sort of amoeba, and he sees his sperm, he sees blood cells, he sees bacterial plaque from between his teeth, and he sends it off to the Royal Society. No one takes him seriously because he writes in common Dutch. But Hook is the person that he persists with, and he is the man who has the revelation and goes, I think this guy might be onto something.
Yes, that's right. So Hook actually does publish his work. He translates it. He does publish his work, and Leven Hook is, as I said, he's a really bizarre character, because having made this discovery, he then refuses to let anyone look through his microscopes, which is totally bizarre. But he's extraordinarily secretive, because he thinks that someone's going to steal his microscope. He makes about 500 of them. If you've ever have a chance, there's one in Cambridge. There are many in the Leven Hook Museum, but they're really very beautiful. They're small little plates with lenses that he would make himself.
And the lenses are tiny. They don't look like, when you think of a microscope, you think of the thing you look down like that, but they're little plates.
They're little things, and you hold them up to the sun, and you have to put a drop of water in front of it. I made one, a very bad one, but it was COVID, and I had nothing else to do except to make a Leven Hook microscope.
Did it work?
Yes, it did work, actually, after a lot of time. I mean, these days it's easier because you can order the plate, and you can order a plate with a with a hole in it, and you can order the lens. So it's I didn't have to blow my own glass and grind my own glass lens.
Because the lens itself,
I
could nerd out on this, and we mustn't, because I'm an optics nerd, but it's like a little peppercorn. It's round, it's spherical.
It has to be very accurately made. It has to be ground to perfection, because otherwise you get aberrations and you can't see anything. But anyway, that's the optics piece of it. I
mean, we could just talk about the history for an hour, because it is it's really the birth of biology, and it's foundational to the Royal Society, and we're in what was Gresham College here, which is very closely associated with that anyway. We could talk about that for hours, and we won't, because we need to move on. But so Van Leven Hook sees these cells for the first time, and it begins to develop. It turns into, over the next century or so, into what becomes what we've described as the sort of one of the grand unifying theories of biology, that all life is made of cells. But it takes a weird dinner party for this unification to happen, with a bunch of odd characters, which you describe beautifully in the introduction. What happened?
So there are two students, Schleiden and Schwann, and they're both unusual characters. One of them is a lawyer turned botanist. And he's a lawyer turned botanist because he hates law. He tries to shoot himself, but he misses. And so...
and that's not funny, but it's just at the dinner party, he's got a massive scar on his head when he invents cell biology.
Yes, so and then a zoologist. And what Schleiden, he's looking at... they both work in Germany under Johannes Müller, and he's been looking at the development of plants as a botanist. And he's been seeing some commonalities. But the most important commonality, which he will state later, is that when he sees the plant developing, he sees them forming through cells. He sees the process of formation of an organism through cells. And they're at this dinner party in Berlin, and the zoologist says, well, wait a second, I've been looking at the growth of animals, and particularly tadpoles, and I too have been seeing the formation of the organism through cells. And so they sort of drag each other to the microscope. And very soon they realize that they've stumbled on a common phenomenon that seems to link the plant world and the animal world. And that is that both animals and plants are formed through cells. And so they make the first tenets of cell biology, that all animals and plants are formed through cells. And in fact, that all organisms are made of cells. So they lay down the basis of cell biological theory, the universality. Lots of people had seen cells before, Leven Hook we talked about, but no one had made the incredibly audacious claim that in fact, across the entire animal and plant and other kingdoms, that everything was a cell. Every living creature was made of cells.
And so that's the first part of cell theory. Cell theory comes in two parts. The first is that all life is made of cells. And then the second part comes a few years later, and it also is based in Germany, it's based out of Berlin, but another amazing story about where cells come from. Because if all life is made of cells, and these people like Schwann and Schleiden and others are looking at how they develop, how organisms develop. Embryology is a big thing at that time, as it is today. But there was the question of where cells come from in the first place. And for the previous 2,000 years, there was an assumption that they just sprang out of nowhere, that they spontaneously generated. And that turns out to be not true.
Right, so now we move a little bit further ahead in time. Young 30-odd-year-old pathologist in Germany is studying cells, cell biology, particularly, he's a pathologist, particularly interested in leukemia. And so he picks up on work done by others, and he makes the third claim, or perhaps the second big claim, which is that all cells come from other cells. Now, again, all of us know this, it seems very obvious today, but there was a huge debate going on at that point of time about where cells came from. And even Schleiden, the inventor of cell theory, thought that cells sort of crystallized out of some vital fluid. There's a theory called vitalism, and in fact, lots of people still believe it, that in fact there's something special, that we're not just sort of chemical soups walking around. There's something special in our chemical soup. There's some special seasoning that makes life. And what Virchow was saying is, in some ways, he was saying there's no special seasoning. It's life comes from life, cells come from cells. And that's the way we grow. We grow out from a single cell by the division of that cell into 2 cells, into 4 cells, into 8, and so forth, and ad infinitum, until we get the several trillion cells that make up a body. So, and in Latin, that's omnis cellula, a cellula. From cells come from cells. Very radical in its time because of these countervailing theories of spontaneous generation, vitalism, and etc. But then Virchow matures as a physician scientist, and the book is almost dedicated to him. I like the word almost dedicated. It's like he sort of just missed the mark. But anyway.
And he kind of nicked the idea a little bit off someone else, didn't he?
Yes, he did. Well, omnicellular cellula is an idea that actually existed before him in other work, but he sort of brought it out of history and stamped it. But the next 2 ideas are absolutely his, and they're also foundational. The next idea is that all human physiology is the consequence of cellular physiology. Now, let's pause and contemplate that idea for a second. This is in 1840-something or the other. And here is someone saying that everything that we are and do, our bodies do, is a consequence of cells doing something. The fact that we can regulate salt and water, the fact that our brains think, the fact that you and I are having this conversation, it's all a consequence of cells doing something to enable that to happen. The environment, behavior, chance, life happens around it, But ultimately, it has to go down to the cell to be the actor of it. The fact that there's blood rushing through our veins and arteries, there's a consequence of that, and that is that oxygen is being delivered, and nutrients are waste products are being cleared. So this very central idea, all normal physiology is a consequence of cellular physiology, is also radical. And then he just turns that idea on its head. It's the mirror image. And he argues that if that's the case, then all disease, so he gets even more radical now, he argues that all disease must be a disease that is an aberration or dysfunction of cells. So all of a sudden, we have a theory of how the body is made, what makes the body, how cells are born, how physiology occurs, and how and why disease occurs. And with that, you get a complete new universe, as it were, of biology and medicine and cell biology, etc.
These are some of the biggest ideas that anyone's ever had in biology, along with natural selection and universal genetics, and that's why we sing their praises. But I think it is so radical, because if you think about how we now know, we've known for decades, but not centuries, that we start as a single cell, an egg that's being fertilized by a sperm, the biggest cell in the human body and the smallest cell in the human body combined, and that's where all life starts. But the implications of the second part of cell theory, that all cells come from other cells, is a really brain-scrambling concept, because it means that egg cell came from another cell, which means you can trace the lineage of that through your mother.
Yeah, now you're asking a very interesting question, yeah.
And then it means you can go back all the way through the history of life on Earth, that when you cut your finger, or when you get a bleeding gum, or you graze your knee, and the cells that grow to repair that damage, they are part of a lineage which starts 4 billion years ago and is unbroken.
And that's incredible, right? So if you really think about that idea as unbroken, the unbroken lineage, in other words, if you could draw that infinite tree of trillions of cells that we all have in common, plus the other trillion that are in bacteria, plus the other trillion that more than a trillion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you were to take that entire lineage tree and wind the clock backwards, and wind it backwards, and wind it backwards, and wind it backwards, you would end up with one cell, the mother of all life. That was a very pregnant pause.
I know, I just wanted to let that land, because it's the biggest idea that there is. It is the greatest story ever told. We call that cell LUCA, the last universal common ancestor, and we think it started, well, I'm part of a branch of science that thinks that it started at the bottom of the ocean, possibly in hydrothermal vents about 3.9 billion years ago, but from LUCA, which divided and divided for the next 2 billion years, for the next 2 billion years after that, and when you do anything, the third part of what you're saying, any interaction you have with the rest of the universe is modulated by a lineage which started 4 billion years ago. These are big thoughts, and I think we don't talk about them much, do we?
Yes, I think it's partly because the mind boggles a little bit at the thought, but they're true. I mean, from that, there's been lots of attempts to create, and as you know, there are lots of competing theories about where the LUCA existed or was born, or how. There are theories about the most accepted theory is that wherever it was, whether in the hydrothermal vent or in clay, layers of clay, there was the birth of a molecule, probably RNA, as far as we know, and which had either by itself or as a partner the capacity to duplicate itself. But that is not life, because, as I explain in the book, if the if the original molecule and its duplicator drifted away, then that would be the end of life. It would be like lovers who had been lost forever, and none of us would exist, and nor would the Mona Lisa. There would be nothing. So these two molecules, or whether it was one molecule is a question mark, had to create a membrane around themselves. And that membrane is made out of fat. So they had to be fat molecules. And what's amazing is that in laboratories like Jack Szostak's lab and other labs, you can actually make these proto-cells. You can create artificially a blob of fat, which resembles in many ways the membranes that our cells have, very primitively. And if you keep adding more and more fat molecules to them as they absorb more fat molecules, these protocells divide. Now, these are completely lifeless, remember. They have none of the functions of life. They don't respire, but they have one quality of life, which is that they have autonomous cell division. They can split themselves. And if you keep adding more fat, then those two will split themselves further. Now, if you enclose that, or if you take that and enclose within that box a molecule that can duplicate itself and carries information, you all of a sudden begin to, again, walk through the thought for a moment with me. You've got a membrane, you've got a little box, and inside that box you've placed a machine that can duplicate itself, make another copy of itself, so that when the box divides, that piece of information also divides. And now you can encode that piece of information, and that piece of information can start making things. It can start doing things. It can make more copies of itself, and so forth. And now you begin to start thinking, is that life? And we're sort of at the edge of what might be LUCA or something, and wherever it happened. That's one prominent theory. There are many other theories that we won't talk about, but yeah.
No, I mean, honestly, we could spend another hour talking about that, but I mean, I said...